"Well, I'll be hornswoggled, Buster," I said, my voice a low chuckle. "It appears that Lake Harmony's continued harmony depends entirely on the goodwill and operational status of Frank Miller's long-forgotten backyard plumbing." I gave the rusty wheel an affectionate pat. "And right now, old boy," I confided, the grin widening into something verging on maniacal, "my goodwill is running a little bit dry. In fact, it might just be about to experience a significant HOA-induced drought." It was one of those perfect Saturday mornings, the kind that poets write about if poets were into the smell of two-stroke engine oil and the promise of outsmarting a largemouth bass. I had the Serenity now, my trusty old fishing boat, hitched up and ready. Coffee was steaming in the travel mug, tackle box was packed, and Buster, my even trustier Labrador, was already drooling on the passenger seat in anticipation of shore-leave-sniffing adventures. Today was the day I was going to finally investigate Old Man Hemlock's tall tales about a monster bass lurking near the sunken sycamore on the far side of Lake Harmony. I pulled up to the community boat ramp, whistling a jaunty tune, and slammed right into a wall of bureaucratic buffoonery. Or rather, a gate. A brand-new, gleaming, ridiculously over-engineered gate, barring access to the ramp. It wasn't just a gate, it was a statement. It had more locks than a bank vault, a tiny, intimidating keypad that looked like it required a degree in astrophysics to operate, and a sign. Oh, the sign. It was a masterpiece of HOA passive aggression. Lake Harmony boat launch, authorized vessel access only, per HOA Statute 117.3, Revision 12, Section D, Paragraph G. All vessels subject to mandatory width, length, hue, and buoyancy compliance checks prior to each launch. No trailers with excessive rust or undocumented character. Violators will be subject to fines, re-education seminars, and potential banishment from all aquatic adjacent community spaces. Excessive rust or undocumented character? I read aloud, my blood pressure doing a little jig. I glanced at my beloved trailer. Sure, she had a few distinguished rust patches, earned over 20 years of faithful service. Character? She had it in spades. Then I saw him. Herb Smelton, our new HOA president and self-appointed Commodore of Lake Harmony. He was standing by his own oversized, gleaming white pontoon boat, which was, naturally, already bobbing peacefully in the water on the other side of the gate, meticulously buffing an already spotless chrome railing. He wore a captain's hat that was at least 2 sizes too big, perched jauntily on his thinning gray hair. "Morning, Herb," I called out, trying to keep the incredulity from my voice. "Bit of a surprise here. What in the Sam Hill is this metallic monstrosity? I was planning on being 3 miles out by now, communing with nature and, with any luck, that monster bass." Herb straightened up, adjusting his ridiculous hat. A small, smug smile played on his lips. "Ah, Frank, progress, efficiency, security!" He patted the gate with proprietary pride. "The new Aqua Century 5000, state-of-the-art. Keeps the riffraff out, you understand? And more importantly, ensures all watercraft meet our new enhanced community standards." His gaze flickered pointedly towards the Serenity now and her venerable trailer. "Riffraff?" I echoed. "Herb, I've been launching this boat here since before you even knew what an HOA was, probably back when you were still figuring out which end of a stapler to use. What enhanced standards are we talking about? Does my boat now need a cravat and a letter of recommendation from the Queen?" "Your official access code for the keypad was mailed out earlier this week," Herb said, ignoring my sarcasm with the practiced ease of a seasoned bureaucrat. "Should arrive in your mailbox in approximately 7 to 10 business days. After your vessel passes its mandatory pre-inspection, of course. We've got a checklist. It's quite thorough." I felt a vein begin to throb in my temple. Pre-inspection. For the Serenity now. Herb, this boat practically is a community standard. She's seen more fish than your fancy pontoon boat has seen cocktail napkins. Herb just shrugged, that infuriating little smile still plastered on his face. Rules are rules, Frank. For the good of the community. We wouldn't want just anyone sullying our pristine waters with, well, you know. He gestured vaguely at my setup. Enjoy the lovely shore-bound morning. Heard the bird-watching is particularly fine this time of year. With a final self-satisfied pat to his pontoon, he turned and sauntered off, leaving me sputtering in a cloud of bureaucratic exhaust. Excessive character? I muttered, glaring at the offensive sign, then at a particularly distinguished patch of rust on my trailer fender that I'd always thought gave it a certain rugged charm. I'll show him character, the overinflated pontoon pilot. Buster whined sympathetically from the truck. Even he knew this was an outrage. Back in my workshop later that day, the incident at the boat ramp was still simmering in my gut like bad chili. I was angrily oiling a wrench that didn't need oiling, Buster watching me with his big, soulful eyes. This wasn't just about a gate or a boat. This was about Herb Smelton. Herb had taken over as HOA president about 6 months ago, a recent retiree from some soul-crushing middle management job where he'd presumably spent decades perfecting the art of pointless regulation. Now, unleashed upon Lake Harmony Estates, he was a man possessed, a tin-pot dictator drunk on the heady wine of bylaw enforcement. His reign of terror had begun subtly, with memos about optimizing refuse collection schedules and standardizing mailbox aesthetics. But it had quickly escalated. I remembered the community meeting where he'd unveiled his grand plan for aquatic purity. Furthermore, he'd announced, tapping a laser pointer at a slide depicting a slightly bewildered goldfish, all decorative pond fish, including but not limited to Carassius auratus and Cyprinus rubrifuscus, must now be registered with the HOA and fitted with approved microchip identification tags. We cannot have unauthorized koi upsetting the delicate ecological balance of our ornamental water features. Poor Mildred Macmillan, who had a small, charming fish pond in her front yard, had timidly raised her hand. But they're just goldfish, Herb. From the pet store. I call them Sparky and Bubbles. Herb had fixed her with a steely gaze. Gold, Mildred, is a relative term. Compliance, however, is absolute. Unchipped aquatic residents are a clear and present danger to aesthetic uniformity. Then came the paddleboat color mandate. Only Lake Harmony blue or serene sunset orange were deemed acceptable hues for personal paddle-powered watercraft. My neighbor Dave, who had a perfectly good bright yellow paddleboat, was forced to repaint it or face daily fines. There were new restrictions on the types of beverage containers allowed dockside. Apparently, certain brands of insulated tumblers were visually discordant with the lakeside ambiance. Herb even tried, unsuccessfully thank heavens, to regulate the species of worms used for bait, claiming that non-native annelids could pose a threat to the indigenous soil pH. My boat, the Serenity now, and my unfettered access to the lake were my sanctuary. It was where I went to escape the creeping tide of Herb's lunacy. And now, with his Aqua Sentry 5000 and its 17-digit codes, he was planting his flag squarely in the middle of my escape route. He wants to play gatekeeper with my Serenity, Buster? I grumbled, finally putting down the over-oiled wrench. We'll just see about that. We'll see who's gating whom around here. Buster thumped his tail, always ready for a bit of righteous indignation on my behalf. The next few days were spent in a state of simmering frustration. I tried calling the HOA office to get this pre-inspection scheduled, but was met with a Byzantine voicemail system that seemed designed by Franz Kafka on a particularly bad day. The promised access code remained stubbornly absent from my mailbox. Meanwhile, from my back deck, I could see Herb Smelton and his cronies zipping around Lake Harmony on their compliant, perfectly hued watercraft, their laughter echoing across the water like the taunts of smug nautical overlords. Dejected, I took to long walks around the less manicured parts of my property, the bit that backed onto a dense thicket of woods. Buster, of course, was thrilled with these exploratory rambles. It was on one of these walks, following the meandering path of a small, nameless creek that trickled through the back 40, that the gears in my old engineer's brain began to turn. I hadn't paid much attention to this particular creek in years. It was mostly overgrown, a bit marshy in places, but I vaguely remembered my grandfather, who'd owned this land long before Lake Harmony Estates was even a twinkle in a developer's eye, mentioning an old sluice gate he'd built. For managing the marsh, he'd called it, keeping the lower pasture from turning into a bog. Curiosity piqued, I pushed through a tangle of wild rhododendrons, Buster forging ahead like a furry bulldozer. And there it was, almost hidden by a curtain of ivy and a decade's worth of fallen leaves, but unmistakably there. A small, surprisingly intact concrete and timber dam structure. Embedded within it was a heavy, rust-covered but decidedly functional-looking wheel mechanism connected to a thick wooden sluice gate. The creek pooled up behind it, forming a small, deep pond, before trickling out through the partially open gate and meandering off in the general direction of Lake Harmony. A dusty corner of my memory lit up. Old deeds, county survey maps I'd glanced at when I inherited the property, that little asterisk denoting a man-made water control structure. My property line, I recalled with a sudden, sharp clarity, included this forgotten dam. And this little, unassuming creek, I now realized with a jolt that was far more energizing than my morning coffee, was the sole significant feeder for the HOA's much-vaunted, award-winning, and currently inaccessible to me Lake Harmony. I stared at the rusty wheel, then in the direction of the smugly shimmering lake, just visible through the trees. A slow, delicious grin spread across my face. Buster, sensing a shift in my mood, barked inquiringly. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled, Buster," I said, my voice a low chuckle. "It appears that Lake Harmony's continued harmony depends entirely on the goodwill and operational status of Frank Miller's long-forgotten backyard plumbing." I gave the rusty wheel an affectionate pat. "And right now, old boy," I confided, the grin widening into something verging on maniacal, "my goodwill is running a little bit dry. In fact, it might just be about to experience a significant HOA-induced drought." The engineer in me couldn't resist. The next afternoon, armed with a can of penetrating oil, a heavy-duty wrench, and a long steel pry bar, I returned to my newfound domain. Buster supervised, offering moral support and occasionally chasing squirrels away from the critical work area. The brush around the dam was cleared away with a satisfying amount of hacking and sawing. I examined the sluice gate mechanism more closely. It was old, certainly. Grandpappy Miller had built things to last. The concrete was sound, the timbers still solid, if weathered. The wheel was stiff, but after a liberal application of oil and some carefully applied leverage with the pry bar, it groaned, creaked, and then, with a shudder, turned. The heavy wooden gate slid down another few inches into its channel. The flow of water through the outlet pipe noticeably, dramatically, lessened. "Interesting," I murmured, wiping grease from my hands. "Very, very interesting indeed." I cranked the wheel back up, restoring the flow. "For now." The plan began to crystallize, not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, satisfying burn, like good bourbon. This wasn't just about stopping the water, or even just getting my boat access back. This was about making a point. This was about art, the art of retaliatory hydrology. The HOA's annual Bass Bonanza fishing tournament, the jewel in Herb Smelton's commodorial crown, was just 3 weeks away. They'd just proudly announced in the community newsletter that they'd stocked Lake Harmony with $5,000 worth of feisty, trophy-sized largemouth bass. Expensive fish. Fish that required a certain depth of water to thrive. Herb and his Aqua Sentry 5000 think they control access, do they, Buster? I said, sketching out a rough diagram of the dam on a piece of scrap wood. We're about to engage in a little educational seminar on the fascinating subject of upstream riparian rights and the critical importance of respecting one's elders, especially when those elders happen to control your primary water supply. Buster wagged his tail, fully on board with any plan that involved me sounding gleeful and him potentially getting to splash in a modified creek. My plan wasn't to destroy Lake Harmony. That would be unneighborly, and probably illegal on a scale that even Sergeant Davies couldn't ignore. No, my plan was more subtle, more elegant. I needed to adjust its enthusiasm, and for that, I needed to make my control point look less like a forgotten relic and more like a serious, professionally managed water control installation. And I needed a sign, a really good sign. That's where Mud Puddicombe came in. Mud was a local legend, a semi-retired earthworks and general heavy machinery savant who'd probably forgotten more about moving dirt and controlling water than most civil engineers ever learned. His workshop/junkyard on the outskirts of town was a glorious testament to a life spent wrestling with the earth. I found Mud coaxing a grumbling old bulldozer back to life with a combination of brute force and what sounded suspiciously like whispered sweet nothings. "Mud," I said, after he'd finally silenced the beast with a well-aimed whack from a 2-pound hammer. "I've got a little project for you." I explained the situation, showed him the old sluice gate. Mud, a man of few words and much chewing tobacco, listened patiently, a twinkle in his eye. "Controlling the water, eh, Frank?" he said, spitting a stream of brown liquid with pinpoint accuracy at a passing beetle. "Having a bit of a disagreement with them fancy folks down at the lake, are you?" "You could say that, Mud," I replied. "They've recently, shall we say, restricted my access to certain recreational pursuits that involve large bodies of water and my boat. I'm merely exploring my own property rights in a proactive and hydraulically focused manner." Mud chuckled, a sound like rocks tumbling in a cement mixer. "Hydraulic dialogue, I like that. Got a nice ring to it." He eyed the old dam structure critically. "All right, Frank, I can fix this old girl up for you. Reinforce the concrete. Put a new geared winch on her so you can adjust her by the teeniest smidgen with one hand if you want. Make her look real official-like." "And a sign, Mud," I said. "I need a very clear, very official-looking sign. Something along the lines of, private property, sluice gate control area, no trespassing, unauthorized personnel, keep out. Violators will be used as catfish bait, and not the good kind." Maybe with some very pointy, unfriendly lettering. Mud's grin widened. "Catfish bait, eh? I got just the sign painter for that. Fella down in Oakhaven. Does good skulls too, if you're so inclined." "Just the pointy letters will suffice, Mud," I said. "We want to be intimidating, not actively macabre, though a small, tastefully rendered skull icon wouldn't go amiss." A week later, Mud Puddicombe had worked his magic. The old sluice gate was reborn. The crumbling concrete was patched and reinforced. A gleaming new-geared winch mechanism was installed, its handle invitingly graspable. And the signs. Oh, the signs were glorious. One large, professionally painted metal sign declared, Miller Creek Dam and Water Control Station. Private property. Authorized personnel only. And right below it, a slightly smaller, more menacing one. Warning. Sluice gate operational area. Sudden water level changes possible. Trespassers will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law and possibly used in unorthodox angling experiments. Mudd had even managed to incorporate a subtle yet undeniably skull-like embellishment in the corner. It was perfect. Phase 1 of Operation Gentle Drought commenced that very evening. Under the cloak of a moonless night, I made my way to my newly christened Miller Creek Dam and Water Control Station. With a smooth, satisfying turn of the new winch, I lowered the sluice gate. Not all the way, just a little. A few inches. Enough to reduce the outflow by, say, 20%. Enough that Lake Harmony, jewel of the HOA, would begin a very slow, almost imperceptible descent. The next morning, I took Buster for a conspicuously leisurely stroll past the Lake Harmony community dock. Herb Smelton was there, naturally, supervising the installation of a new HOA-approved brand of algae-resistant dock bumpers. "Morning, Herb," I called out cheerfully. "Lovely day for it. Say," I squinted at the water, "does the lake look a bit lower to you today? Or is it just my old eyes playing tricks on me?" Herb scoffed. "Nonsense, Frank. Lake levels are meticulously maintained by natural aquifers and our state-of-the-art, computer-monitored overflow weir. I had our consultant, Dr. Aquamax, run a full hydrological simulation just last month, perfectly stable." He went back to berating the dock bumper installers about achieving precise 90-degree angles. I just smiled and continued my stroll, Buster trotting happily beside me. "Oh, Herb, you and your computer-monitored weir have no idea what you're up against." Each night, I made a small adjustment, another inch or two down on the sluice gate. The effect was subtle, insidious, like a very slow leak in a very large bathtub. A few days later, the murmurs began. I overheard them at the local hardware store, where I was buying an unnecessary amount of bird seed to maintain my cover as a harmless nature enthusiast. "Swear I had to wade further out to cast my line this morning down at the lake," grumbled old Jedediah, a fixture on the community fishing dock. "Water's definitely pulling back from the banks." "And them new bass they stocked?" chimed in his companion Martha. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of 'em. Probably all sulking in the deep, what's left of it. If there is any deep left." Herb Smelton was seen increasingly frequently pacing the shoreline of Lake Harmony, a tape measure in one hand and his phone pressed to his ear, his voice growing increasingly agitated. He was making frantic calls, I later learned, to the county water board, to a team of bewildered geologists, and even, according to neighborhood gossip, to a psychic who specialized in unexplained aquatic disturbances and moody water sprites. The psychic, apparently, told him the lake was emotionally constipated and needed to release its repressed currents. Herb had then apparently tried to lead a communal positive affirmation session at the water's edge, which had been sparsely attended and largely unsuccessful in raising the water level. The inevitable confrontation came a week into Operation Gentle Drought. Herb, his face a mask of fury and confusion, must have finally followed the feeder creek upstream. Perhaps a disgruntled landscaper, miffed about Herb's new regulations on the unauthorized commingling of deciduous and coniferous mulch, had seen Mudd Puddicombe's truck near my property and dropped a dime. Whatever the reason, Herb, flanked by a nervous-looking Agnes Periwinkle, she of the lawn-measuring obsession, now apparently Herb's deputy in all things aquatic, appeared at my property line, right where my very official-looking signs were now prominently displayed. "Miller!" Herb roared, his voice cracking like a pubescent Viking. "What is the meaning of this damnable dam?" He gestured wildly at my beautifully refurbished sluice gate control station. "Afternoon, Herb, Agnes," I said calmly. I was, as it happened, performing some routine maintenance, which consisted of me sitting in a lawn chair with a fishing rod, dangling a line into the small pond that had formed behind my dam on my property. Buster was napping at my feet. Lovely day for it. The bluegills in my private reservoir are biting like crazy. Care to join me? Though I must warn you, my lures are probably not up to HOA chromatic standards. "Don't you play coy with me, Miller," Herb sputtered. "You're draining Lake Harmony. You're committing hydrological terrorism. This is an outrage, an affront to communal moisture rights." Right on cue, 2 police cruisers pulled up the dirt track leading to my little corner of paradise. Out stepped a young, earnest-looking Officer Krupke and the infinitely more world-weary Sergeant Davies. Herb had clearly been busy on the phone. "Officers, thank heavens!" Herb exclaimed, rushing towards them. "Arrest this man. He's stealing our water. He's sabotaging our entire ecosystem. He's an H2O anarchist." I ambled over, Buster trotting beside me. "Afternoon, officers," I said politely. "Mr. Smelton here seems a bit agitated, perhaps dehydrated. I was just explaining to him that I'm performing some necessary water management on my own private property, utilizing my own private dam and sluice gate, as is my riparian right. I have all the deeds, surveys, and grandfathered water rights documentation right here, if you'd care to peruse them." I produced a thick, impressively official-looking folder I'd prepared for just such an occasion. Sergeant Davies, with the air of a man who had seen far too many neighborhood disputes escalate into existential crises, took the folder. He scanned the documents, then looked at my dam, then at the sputtering Herb, then back at me. Officer Krupke looked utterly bewildered, clearly wondering if hydrological terrorism was covered in the police academy curriculum. "Mr. Smelton," Sergeant Davies said finally, his voice a gravelly baritone of profound weariness. "As far as I can tell from these documents, which appear to be quite legitimate, Mr. Miller is operating within the legal bounds of his own property. This structure," he gestured to my dam, "is on his land. The water flows through his land. He appears to have the right to manage that flow." But our lake," Herb wailed. "Our bass bonanza, our communal moisture." "Sir," Sergeant Davies continued, his patience clearly wearing thinner than the ice on Lake Harmony in July, "this appears to be a civil matter, a dispute over water rights and, frankly, what sounds like a very complicated neighborhood disagreement. We can't arrest a man for adjusting his own plumbing. Even if it is, admittedly, rather large-scale plumbing. Unless," he glanced at my warning sign, "that bit about using trespassers as catfish bait is a credible, actionable threat. Which, between you and me, Mr. Miller," he gave me a look, "sounds more like a creative fishing tip than a criminal enterprise." Officer Krupke, to his credit, managed to suppress a snort. Herb, however, was incandescent with rage. He started shouting about lawsuits, injunctions, violations of the spirit of community, the inherent evil of upstream property owners. The officers, having determined that no actual crime was in progress, unless you counted crimes against Herb's ego, politely extricated themselves from the situation, advising Herb to consult a lawyer and perhaps invest in a good rain barrel. As they drove away, Sergeant Davies gave me a look over his shoulder that I interpreted as a mixture of weary amusement and a silent plea to never, ever call him about this nonsense again. With the police proving unhelpful to his cause, Herb was forced to resort to other tactics, namely pleading and blustering, and more pleading. The Bass Bonanza was now just a week away. The water level in Lake Harmony was down a good 1.5 feet. Large, unsightly mudflats ringed the once proud shoreline. The HOA's fancy floating docks were listing at awkward angles, their underbellies exposed like beached whales. The $5,000 worth of trophy bass were presumably huddled in the rapidly shrinking deeper pools, contemplating their poor life choices and the general unfairness of aquatic real estate. Panic, thick and pungent, was wafting through Lake Harmony estates. I, meanwhile, had added a new sign to my dam control station. Water level adjustment scheduled daily, weather and Frank's mood permitting. Inquiries? Please submit Form 37B, Aquatic Dialogue Request, to F. Miller Esq., Upstream Proprietor. Allow 8 months for processing and potential amusement. Herb started making daily pilgrimages to my gate. His demeanor shifted with each visit, veering wildly from impotent rage to desperate supplication. "Miller, you fiend!" he'd shout one day, his face purple. "You have to raise the water. The Bass Bonanza is our flagship community event. The mayor is coming. We have sponsors. Think of the children." The children, I'd noticed, were actually quite enjoying exploring the newly exposed mudflats and collecting interesting rocks. The next day, he'd be more conciliatory. "Frank, my dear friend, my valued neighbor," he'd begin, his voice dripping with false bonhomie. "Surely we can come to some sort of mutually beneficial hydrological understanding. A little more flow, perhaps, for the sake of community spirit?" My response was always polite, always regretful. "Terribly sorry to hear about your ongoing hydrological challenges, Herb," I'd say, leaning on my winch handle with a thoughtful expression. "It's a complex ecosystem, isn't it? One thing affects another. Funny how that works. Now, if certain other community amenities, like, say, boat ramp access for long-standing, law-abiding residents with impeccably characterized trailers, were perhaps more fluidly administered, these unfortunate situations might be less likely to arise. Just a thought, you understand. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe this winch requires a delicate micro-calibration. Downwards, I think." The night before the scheduled Bass Bonanza was, by all accounts, a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos at the Lake Harmony Community Hall. I, coincidentally, took Buster for a late-night stroll past the building, the windows of which were blazing with light and echoing with raised, frantic voices. The lake was now down nearly 3 feet. It looked less like a pristine fishing paradise and more like a very large, very sad, and rapidly shrinking puddle. The Bass Bonanza was clearly a bust. I'd heard whispers that several key sponsors had pulled out, citing unforeseen shallow water conditions. The mayor, who was actually just a town councilman with aspirations and a good publicist, had suddenly developed a prior engagement. Herb's voice, cracking with a despair that was almost pitiful, could be heard above the din. "We have to do something. Can we pump water in? From where? Does anyone own a fleet of tanker trucks and a very, very long hose?" Agnes Periwinkle, the lawn-measuring aficionado who had apparently now been promoted to chief hydrological crisis consultant, was heard suggesting a large-scale, community-wide rain dance. "My cousin in Arizona swears by them for her prize-winning cacti," she'd exclaimed. The meeting, from what I could gather from the snippets of panicked shouting and mournful groans, devolved into a spectacular festival of finger-pointing, blame-assigning, and general lamentation over the tragic demise of their beloved fishing tournament. It was music to my ears. The next morning, the day of the doomed bonanza, I decided to survey my handiwork more closely. I took a walk along the now vastly expanded shoreline of Lake Harmony, or, as I was beginning to think of it, Frank's auxiliary mud puddle. And as I looked at the exposed lake bed, something unexpected caught my eye. With the water level so drastically lowered, years, possibly decades, of accumulated junk were now starkly visible. Old tires, a couple of rusted-out 55-gallon drums, a child's tricycle, a veritable mountain of beer cans and plastic bottles, even what looked like the skeletal remains of a sunken rowboat. It was an absolute eyesore, and I realized with a pang of something akin to responsibility. My upstream water, when I eventually decided to release it, would be flowing directly into this aquatic junkyard. On a whim, and perhaps because a small, traitorous part of me genuinely didn't want my pristine creek water to be sullied by this mess, I went back to my garage, grabbed a handful of heavy-duty contractor bags, my sturdiest work gloves, and my trusty wheelbarrow. I started cleaning up a section of the exposed lake bed, the part closest to where Miller Creek eventually sighed its way into the larger body of water. It was mucky, smelly work. Buster, after an initial flurry of enthusiastic sniffing, decided it was beneath his dignity and retired to a shady spot to supervise. After about an hour, a few of the neighborhood kids, bored because the lake was obviously unfishable, and the bass bonanza had been unceremoniously postponed due to unforeseen environmental factors, wandered over. "What you doing, Mr. Miller?" Young Timmy Periwinkle, Agnes's nephew, surprisingly un-HOA-like, asked, kicking at a half-buried muffler. "Just a bit of aquatic beautification, Timmy," I said, wrestling a particularly stubborn bicycle frame from the ooze. "Trying to improve the lake's character. It seems it had a bit too much undocumented personality." To my surprise, Timmy and his friends, after a moment's hesitation, started to help. They seemed to find a perverse joy in excavating disgusting treasures from the mud. Then, a couple of the more reasonable adult residents, the ones who hadn't been entirely blinded by Herb Smelton's bluster, saw what was happening and pitched in. Mr. Fitzwilliam, my wink-sharing neighbor, arrived with a rake and a determined expression. Even Mildred McMillan, she of the tagged goldfish, brought down a thermos of lemonade and some cookies. What started as a solitary act of grumpy tidiness somehow morphed into an impromptu, unofficial lake cleanup day. We pulled out a shocking amount of garbage: tires, fishing nets, a deflated inflatable Santa Claus, enough plastic bottles to build a small island. It was disgusting. It was exhausting. It was surprisingly satisfying. By late afternoon, a significant section of the lake bed looked remarkably better. We hadn't solved the water level problem, obviously, but we'd made a dent in the accumulated grime. Later that evening, as I was hosing the last of the primordial ooze off my boots, a figure appeared at my front gate. It was Herb Smelton. He was mud-stained, his captain's hat was crumpled in his hand, and he looked utterly, comprehensively defeated. "Miller," he said, his voice raspy. "Frank, look, about the lake, and the boat ramp, perhaps there was a slight misunderstanding, a minor overreach in gate-related administrative enthusiasm, shall we say." I raised an eyebrow. "Minor overreach, Herb. My prize-winning petunias have experienced minor overreaches from your aggressively manicured Flora Committee that were less egregious than that Aqua Century 5000 monstrosity." Herb sighed, a long, gusty exhalation that seemed to carry all the woes of a deposed Commodore. All right. The gate was a mistake. The 17-digit access code was, in hindsight, perhaps excessive. The mandatory trailer rust inspection. Look." He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. "What I'm trying to say is, if you were to, hypothetically, see your way clear to restoring the water level in Lake Harmony, just enough for, say, a modest but dignified fall fishing festival next month, I could personally guarantee, as HOA president, that your boat, the Serenity Now, would be granted immediate and lifetime grandfathered vessel of distinction status. No inspections ever. Your own reserved parking spot right at the ramp. We could even put up a small plaque." A plaque? I considered it. The cleanup had been surprisingly gratifying. Seeing the community, or at least a part of it, working together had been not entirely unpleasant. And the thought of a plaque, F. Miller, grandfathered vessel of distinction, did have a certain appeal. Plus, I was actually starting to miss fishing in the main lake. My private reservoir was nice, but Old Man Hemlock's monster bass wasn't going to catch itself in my backyard. A plaque, you say, Herb? I mused, stroking my chin. And this grandfathered vessel of distinction status, would that come with immunity from any future regulations regarding, say, the hue of my fishing lures, or the approved decibel level of my celebratory fish-on? Shouts? Herb winced, but nodded. Immunity, absolute. Within reason, of course. Of course, I said. I made him put it all in writing, on official HOA letterhead, witnessed by Mud Puddicombe, who I called over for the occasion, much to Herb's chagrin, and Buster, who provided an official paw print. The grand refill, as it came to be known, was a carefully managed affair. I couldn't just open the sluice gate all the way. That would be irresponsible and potentially flood Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning petunias downstream, the other Mrs. Henderson, the nice one. So, over the course of a week, I gradually, painstakingly, raised the gate, inch by inch, allowing Miller Creek to once again breathe life into Lake Harmony. The HOA, thoroughly chastened and perhaps a little bit terrified of my newfound hydrological power, removed the offending Aqua Sentry 5000 from the boat ramp. In its place, they installed a simple, manual swing gate. And, as promised, there was a freshly painted parking spot waiting for me. Reserved, F. Miller, Grand Admiral of the Lake, by hydraulic decree. Herb Smelton himself, looking rather sheepish, unveiled the small, slightly crooked brass plaque next to it. In grateful recognition of Frank Miller's generous and timely contributions to Lake Harmony's hydrological stability and the continued advancement of community boating access. I confess, a ridiculous surge of pride swelled within me. It was almost worth the whole ordeal just for that plaque. The hastily reorganized Fall Fish Fiesta took place a month later. The lake wasn't quite at its former glory. It would take time for the ecosystem to fully recover, but it was fishable. I launched the Serenity Now without so much as a sideways glance from any HOA officials. In fact, several fellow boaters gave me appreciative nods. Herb Smelton even managed a stiff, but undeniably respectful wave from his pontoon boat, which he now referred to as a community outreach vessel. The fishing wasn't spectacular that day. The recently traumatized bass were still understandably shy, but the atmosphere was lighter, friendlier. People were talking in hushed, reverent tones about the great draining and the miraculous refill. Frank Miller, the quiet retiree with the old boat, had become something of a local legend, the man who controlled the water. Even Agnes Periwinkle, spotting me by the dock, tentatively approached. "Frank," she'd said, peering at me over her spectacles, "you seem to know a great deal about water containment. My small decorative backyard water feature has developed a rather persistent leak. Any advice?" I'd almost fallen off the dock. Life in Lake Harmony Estates settled into a new, slightly wetter, and far more respectful equilibrium. I still made regular visits to my Miller Creek Dam and Water Control Station, not for nefarious purposes, but to clear debris, check the mechanism, and to generally ensure the steady, life-giving flow of water to the community downstream. I'd become the unofficial and somewhat revered upstream guardian of Lake Harmony. The HOA, a humbled entity, now sent me polite, formally worded quarterly requests for water flow status reports, which I filled out with great ceremony and a certain amount of creative embellishment, occasionally adding cryptic notes like flow optimal, but the gnomes predict an early algae bloom if dockside beverage container regulations are not strictly adhered to. Yes, inspired by my previous HOA adventures, I'd acquired a few discreet garden gnomes for my own property, for security. The boat ramp remained gloriously open and accessible. The rust patches on the Serenity Now's trailer were now spoken of with a certain reverence, considered marks of historic character and proven resilience. "Well, Buster," I said one crisp autumn afternoon, giving the old lab a scratch behind his ears as we stood by the sluice gate, watching my creek flow steadily towards the now respectfully managed Lake Harmony. The water gurgled contentedly, a sound far more pleasing than any HOA pronouncement. "Sometimes, my friend, you just gotta pull a few plugs to get people to see the proper flow of common sense. Keeps everyone honest, and the fish a little less stressed." Buster naturally agreed wholeheartedly, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against the damp earth. Some victories, I reflected, were best celebrated with a quiet afternoon on the water, the sun on your face, and the satisfying knowledge that your boat, your access, and indeed the very water itself were finally, truly serene. Now, about that monster bass Old Man Hemlock was always on about. The Serenity Now was more than ready for a proper introduction.